Chapter 1. The Glove in the Garden. The train chugged steadily through the English countryside, puffing little clouds of white smoke into the pale spring sky. Hercule Poirot sat primly by the window in a first-class carriage, an open newspaper folded with military precision across his knees. He was dressed immaculately as always. Charcoal grey suit with a white pocket square, a spotless bow tie, and his famous patent leather shoes gleaming like obsidian. Hastings, seated opposite him, had just finished a boiled egg from the breakfast tray, and was glancing out at the passing hedgerows with idle interest. "Poirot," he said suddenly, stretching his legs, "I still don't see why we're going to Larkswood. There's nothing there but flower shows, garden parties, and dull people talking about their marrows and dahlias." Poirot looked up, arching a well-manicured eyebrow. "Mon ami, you wrong the English countryside. It is not always the dull places that are safe, and you forget. One does not refuse an invitation from Lady Willoughby." Hastings chuckled. "That's true enough. But she didn't exactly invite us for a mystery. Didn't she just say she had something curious to show you?" Poirot folded the newspaper and placed it precisely on the seat beside him. "Precisely. And when a woman of Lady Willoughby's age and character tells me something is curious, I listen. She is not prone to flights of imagination. A most formidable lady." Lady Caroline Willoughby was a grand dame of the old sort, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a tongue as sharp as any scalpel. She lived in a sprawling Elizabethan manor outside the village of Larkswood, and was known for her elaborate garden fêtes, antique jewellery collection, and no-nonsense opinions on modern life. Poirot had once solved a minor theft for her at a charity gala in London, and she had remained in correspondence with him ever since. When the train arrived at Larkswood Halt, a liveried chauffeur awaited them with a green Bentley, and within 20 minutes they were rolling up the winding drive of Larkswood Manor, framed by daffodils and hawthorn in full bloom. Lady Willoughby was waiting in the drawing-room, perched like a bird of prey on a chintz armchair. She wore a dress of rich plum silk, a brooch shaped like a peacock feather, and her expression was that of someone who had just bitten into something sour. "Poirot, my dear man," she cried, "and Captain Hastings, splendid. Come and sit down. You must have some tea. Everything in this house seems to revolve around tea, whether I like it or not." They were barely seated when Lady Willoughby leaned forward and said in a low voice, "I asked you here because of the glove." Poirot blinked. "The glove, madame?" "Yes, the glove. It was found in the rose garden 3 days ago by one of the gardeners. Green velvet, clearly expensive, and, this is the most curious part, it doesn't belong to anyone in the house." Poirot's eyes sparkled with interest. "Ah, now that is indeed curious. May I see it?" Lady Willoughby rose and crossed to a writing-desk, unlocking a drawer and withdrawing a small box. She opened it and presented the contents with a flourish. Inside lay a single glove, small and dainty, the colour of deep moss. It had a row of tiny pearl buttons at the wrist, and was lined with pale satin. The glove was immaculate, with no visible dirt or damage, as though it had barely touched the earth. "I had it cleaned before I knew quite what to do," Lady Willoughby said briskly. I thought at first it must have fallen from someone's handbag during one of our garden strolls, but no one claims it. I've asked all the guests and every servant in the house." Poirot picked up the glove gently and examined it, holding it between his fingertips as though it might vanish. "This is not a cheap item. It is handmade, French, if I am not mistaken. The size suggests a young woman. The condition, you say, was pristine when found?" Lady Willoughby nodded. "Exactly. Found right by the old sundial near the lavender beds. Not a spot of soil or dew on it." Hastings frowned. "Couldn't someone have dropped it just moments before it was found? The gardener found it early in the morning. He swears it wasn't there when he passed by the previous evening." Poirot placed the glove back in the box and steepled his fingers. "And no one has come forward to claim it? Then it is not merely mislaid. It is concealed, hidden perhaps, or planted." Lady Willoughby gave a short laugh. "That's exactly what I thought, and that's why I asked you to come. I have a dreadful feeling about it, Poirot. I may be an old woman, but I am not a fool. I smell trouble in this house." Poirot gave a solemn nod. "I have long learned never to ignore the instincts of an intelligent lady. Tell me, who is currently staying here? Let me see," Lady Willoughby said, ticking names off on her fingers. "There's my nephew Lawrence, useless fellow, but fond of the piano. His fiancée, Miss Alicia Drayton. Quiet girl. Eyes like a frightened deer. Then there's Dr. Felix Webb, retired physician, an old friend of the family. He's brought along his ward, a young lady named Estelle Frobisher. Bit of a bohemian, always sketching. There's also Mr. Julian Roke, he's cataloguing the library, and Miss Barbara Grant, my companion. And of course the usual staff." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you trust them all?" Lady Willoughby's mouth tightened. "I trust Barbara. I trust my cook. The rest I tolerate." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then we must be discreet. I should like to see the rose garden. Also, perhaps you might permit me to speak with each guest briefly, under some pretext, of course." "Pretext nothing," Lady Willoughby snapped. "You may interrogate them openly if you like. I have nothing to hide, and if they do, well, that's their problem." Poirot and Hastings followed her out into the garden a few minutes later. The grounds of Larkswood Manor were extensive and beautifully kept, the grass neatly trimmed, the hedges geometrically clipped, spring flowers lined the pathways, and the old sundial stood at the centre of a circular bed of early roses and lavender, the stone green with age. Poirot stood before the sundial, eyes narrowed, scanning the soil with keen intensity. "Tell me, Hastings," he murmured, "does anything strike you as unusual?" Hastings squinted. "It all looks normal to me. The gardener seems to know his business." "Exactly," Poirot said. "Too neat, too precise. If someone dropped a glove here, why, is there not even a crushed petal? And more than that, why here, beside the sundial?" "Symbolism," Hastings ventured. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Perhaps, or perhaps it was meant to be seen." As they strolled back toward the manor, a slim figure detached itself from a path and approached them. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dress the colour of lemon curd, and in her hand was a sketch-pad. "You must be Mr. Poirot," she said softly. "I'm Estelle Frobisher. Lady Willoughby told me you were coming. I was just sketching the east wing." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, a pleasure." She smiled faintly, her eyes resting on his face with quiet intensity. "Strange things have been happening in this house. I hope you've come to make sense of it." Poirot studied her thoughtfully. "Indeed, mademoiselle, I intend to do precisely that." As Estelle walked away, Hastings gave Poirot a curious glance. "She seems a bit intense." Poirot did not reply. He was staring after the young woman, his mind clearly working. Then he murmured, almost to himself, "A green velvet glove appears in the garden, with no rightful owner. A quiet house full of secrets, and a young woman who sees more than she says. Mon cher Hastings, I believe this is only the beginning." Chapter 2. Whispers Among Roses. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the drawing-room in golden warmth as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings joined Lady Willoughby for a formal tea. The large silver tray bore all the expected delicacies: cucumber sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and a perfectly brewed pot of Earl Grey. Poirot, ever a connoisseur of both order and taste, approved of the arrangement with a content nod, before delicately adding 2 lumps of sugar to his cup. As Lady Willoughby busied herself with the teapot, Poirot took the opportunity to observe his surroundings more closely. The room was elegant and old-fashioned, filled with antiques, delicate china, and family portraits that gazed solemnly from the panelled walls. One large bay window offered a sweeping view of the gardens, and it was here that Poirot's attention lingered. From his vantage point, he could see the sundial where the mysterious glove had been discovered. "You see," Lady Willoughby said, following his gaze, "everything appears so serene. But there's tension underneath it all, the sort of unease that no amount of tea or roses can dispel." Hastings looked puzzled. "But what tension exactly? No one's been hurt. Nothing else has gone missing, has it?" Lady Willoughby gave a tight smile. "Not that I know of. But mark my words, there's something unsaid between the people in this house. You live as long as I have, and you begin to feel these things. I thought the glove might be a sign that someone's trying to stir up trouble, but I can't say who or why." Poirot sipped his tea thoughtfully. A mystery without a crime, perhaps, or at least not a visible one. Yet people do not hide expensive gloves for amusement. No, there is something deliberate here. Just then the drawing-room doors opened and Miss Alicia Drayton entered quietly. A young woman of about 22, she was pale and willowy, with flaxen hair pinned loosely at her nape, and a nervous, almost haunted expression in her large blue eyes. "Oh!" she said with a small start upon seeing them. "I didn't realize we had guests. I'll come back." "Not at all," Lady Willoughby said briskly. "Come in, Alicia. This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings." Alicia curtsied slightly, her hands fluttering at her sides like moths. Poirot stood and gave a courteous bow. "Mademoiselle, the pleasure is mine." She sat on the edge of a sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hastings noticed the way her eyes kept darting toward the window, as though half expecting someone to appear in the garden at any moment. "Are you quite well, Miss Drayton?" Hastings asked gently. Alicia gave a forced smile. "Yes, thank you. Just tired, I suppose. It's so very quiet here. Sometimes the silence is, well, loud." An interesting observation, Poirot said. And yet, one sometimes finds the quiet places can conceal the loudest secrets, n'est-ce pas? Alicia looked at him sharply, then glanced away. Lady Willoughby gave a small, triumphant sniff. "I told you she was uneasy," she muttered, not caring in the least who heard her. Before the conversation could continue, the doors opened once more to admit Lawrence, Lady Willoughby's nephew, a tall man in his early 30s, with a poet's hands and a pinist's distracted air. He gave a languid smile as he entered. "Good afternoon, Aunt Caroline," he said with exaggerated cheer. "I heard you had guests. Are we having a mystery?" "Possibly," Lady Willoughby replied. "And if we are, you're not to make jokes about it. This is serious." Poirot rose again, offering his hand. "Monsieur Lawrence, a pleasure." "The famous detective himself," Lawrence said, shaking Poirot's hand with a slight bow. "You've come to investigate the glove, I presume." "Indeed," Poirot said. "It is a small thing, but small things often lead to larger truths." Lawrence strolled over to the piano and idly struck a few chords. "A woman's glove," he said. "Green velvet, wasn't it? Sounds like something out of a Wilkie Collins novel. You don't think it's Alicia's, do you?" Alicia flushed. "Of course not. I told you, I don't own anything like it." "Relax, my dear," Lawrence said with a dismissive wave. "I was only teasing." Poirot watched the interaction closely. Alicia's discomfort was genuine. Lawrence's flippancy, on the other hand, seemed a calculated mask. Poirot made a mental note. Later that evening, Poirot and Hastings took a turn about the garden. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the lawn. A pair of robins chirped from a hawthorn bush, and somewhere in the distance a gardener's wheelbarrow creaked over gravel. "So," Hastings said, hands in his pockets, "what do you make of them?" Poirot considered. "Miss Drayton is frightened. Of what, I do not yet know. Monsieur Lawrence, he is careless with words, but not with intent. There is something he hides, though I cannot yet say what." "And Estelle Frobisher?" Hastings asked. "She was sketching again this afternoon near the pergola." "Ah, Mademoiselle Estelle," Poirot murmured. "She is observing, always observing. An artist, yes, but more than that, a listener. She hears things. That can be very dangerous." As they passed the sundial again, Poirot paused. He bent down and examined the ground more closely, drawing out a small pocket magnifier. Hastings watched in silence as he leaned close to the base of the stone. "Here," Poirot said quietly. "Look, Hastings, what do you see?" Hastings crouched beside him. "Just a few scuff marks." "Exactly. The gardener is meticulous. Yet someone walked here, deliberately. See the slight heel mark? A woman's shoe. The glove may not have been dropped. It may have been placed with care." As they stood, footsteps approached on the path. It was Estelle Frobisher, her sketchpad tucked under one arm. She smiled faintly. "Good evening, gentlemen." "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, tipping his hat. "Out for an evening sketch?" "I find the light at this hour rather beautiful," she replied, "and shadows are always more interesting than sunlight." Poirot regarded her steadily. "Indeed, but tell me, do you often sketch by the sundial?" She hesitated. "Not usually, only recently. There's something about that spot. It feels like a stage, as though someone is waiting for an audience, waiting for something to happen, Hastings asked. Estelle didn't answer. Instead, she nodded politely and walked away toward the pergola, where she sat and began to sketch the house as the sky turned dusky gold. Poirot watched her for a moment longer, then turned to Hastings. This house, Hastings, it is full of performances. People wear masks. They say little, but feel much. And somewhere in the middle of all this, someone has begun to act, not with words, but with symbols. A glove, Hastings, is never just a glove. And what do you think it means? Hastings asked. Poirot's eyes glinted in the fading light. That, mon ami, we shall soon discover. But mark my words, we are being tested. The glove is the first move in a game, and the player, I think, is very clever indeed. Chapter 3. The Man in the Garden. The morning after their quiet evening walk, Hercule Poirot rose early and impeccably dressed, as was his custom. He adjusted the knot of his tie, polished his moustaches with the care of a surgeon, and gave himself a final, approving glance in the mirror. Hastings, bleary-eyed but compliant, joined him downstairs just as the breakfast bell rang. The household gathered in the dining room for a subdued meal. The long mahogany table was laid with precision. Silver, gleamed eggs were perfectly poached, toast crisp and warm. But despite the domestic charm, Poirot noted a palpable tension among the guests. Conversations were sparse and shallow. Estelle Frobisher studied her plate intently. Alicia Drayton looked pale and distracted, while Lawrence Willoughby spoke, little instead drumming his fingers rhythmically on the table. Lady Willoughby, never one to suffer silence, attempted to enliven the meal with polite inquiries and minor gossip, but even she seemed aware that something had shifted since the discovery of the green velvet glove. After breakfast, Poirot asked for a stroll through the gardens, and Lady Willoughby graciously offered the assistance of their gardener, a man named Timothy Pike, who had served the Willoughbys for nearly 30 years. He was summoned and arrived promptly. A wiry man with a sun-weathered face and eyes the colour of tilled earth. "You wish to see the grounds, sir?" Pike asked, addressing Poirot with a respectful tilt of his cap. "Oui, Monsieur Pike," Poirot said, "and more specifically, the location of the sundial where the glove was found." Pike led them down the gravel path, past a stone fountain and beds of late-blooming roses. The air smelled of dew and lavender. "This here's where it was, sir," Pike said, pointing to the circular patch of grass around the sundial. "Miss Estelle found it yesterday, just there at the base. I keep this area neat, so it stood out right away." "Miss Estelle often walks the garden?" Poirot asked. "Most afternoons, sir. Comes out with her sketch-pad. But that morning she was out earlier than usual, just after sunrise." "Unusual, no?" Poirot murmured. "A change in routine. Did anyone else come through the garden that morning?" "Couldn't say for certain," Pike replied, scratching his chin. "I was pruning the yews by the west hedge. Might have been someone. The grass was damp. Leaves, too. Didn't hear much." Poirot knelt near the sundial and again examined the grass. Though the earth had dried since the previous day, faint impressions still lingered, evidence of a footfall. Poirot leaned closer, lifting a tiny thread from a bush nearby. He held it up, a wisp of green velvet. "Mon ami," he said to Hastings, Someone brushed past this bush with haste or clumsiness, and I doubt it was Estelle. Pike looked intrigued. You think someone planted it, then? On purpose? It seems more likely with each passing minute, Poirot said quietly. Tell me, Monsieur Pike, do you recall any strangers in the village recently? Anyone loitering nearby? Pike furrowed his brow. Now you mention it. There was a fellow hanging about the hedge 2 days ago, just near the boundary. Tall man, didn't look like a local. Poirot straightened. And did he speak to anyone? Not that I saw. Just stood there, watching the house. When I approached, he left by... Just stood there, watching the house. When I approached, he left by the wood path. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Describe him. Well-dressed, not gentry, but respectable. Brown overcoat, trilby hat. Walked with a limp, I think. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. Merci, Monsieur Pike. That is most helpful. I would ask that you keep this conversation to yourself. Pike nodded solemnly and tipped his cap again before returning to his tools. As they wandered back toward the house, Hastings said, What do you make of it? Could he be connected to the glove? I do not believe in coincidence, Hastings. A green glove appears out of nowhere, and a stranger is seen lurking nearby. None. It fits. But the question remains, what is the connection to this household? When they returned, they found Estelle seated beneath the pergola, idly sketching the eastern wing of the house. Her sketch-pad lay open across her lap, pencil flitting delicately across the page. Poirot approached quietly. Mademoiselle, may I admire your work? She looked up, surprised but not displeased. Of course, he studied the drawing. A fine architectural study, capturing every shutter, ivy-laced cornice, and crack in the stonework with astonishing detail. But something else drew his attention. A small, almost invisible figure in the corner of the sketch, standing just outside the hedge. Poirot's finger pointed gently. This figure, was that from imagination? Estelle hesitated. No, I saw someone there 2 mornings ago. I thought perhaps it was a servant I hadn't met. A tall man, perhaps with a limp. She looked startled. Yes, you saw him, too. No, mademoiselle, Poirot said softly. But I have heard of him. She frowned. You think he's important? Let us say I find him compelling. He offered her a warm smile. Merci. Your art tells more than the eye intends, I think. Estelle flushed but said nothing. Later that afternoon, Poirot and Hastings sat once again in the drawing-room, where Alicia Drayton had curled up with a book. She glanced up as they entered, clearly uneasy in their presence. Poirot approached gently. Forgive me, mademoiselle, but might I ask, have you received any letters recently from someone outside the family? She stiffened. No. Why would I? Because I suspect someone, an outsider, has taken a keen interest in this house, and particularly in you. Alicia set her book aside and rose. I've nothing to do with this. I don't know who that man is or what the glove means. But you are frightened, Poirot said kindly. And when people are frightened, they often keep secrets, not from malice, but to protect others, or themselves. Her lip trembled. You think someone's trying to hurt me. Poirot hesitated only briefly. Not yet, but I believe someone is trying to unearth a secret. And secrets, mademoiselle, are dangerous when they are half buried. She shook her head. "I don't know anything. Please don't involve me." Poirot bowed slightly. "As you wish. But should you remember something, anything, you must come to me at once." She nodded, eyes wide. That evening, as twilight settled over Willoughby Hall, Poirot sat in his guest-room and turned over the green velvet glove in his hands. He had asked Lady Willoughby for it earlier, and she had produced it from a drawer where it had been carefully stored. He examined the seams, the lining, the embroidered initials stitched faintly on the inside. E.F. Estelle Frobisher. Hastings said from the doorway. Surely it must be hers. No, Hastings. She would never embroider her own initials into a glove she intended to dispose of, or use as misdirection. Poirot placed the glove gently back in its box. The glove was meant to provoke, he said, to resurrect something long buried, a memory, a guilt, a wound. This is not the first act in a drama, Hastings. It is the second. Hastings frowned. Then what was the first? Poirot's expression darkened. That, he said, is what I intend to find out before the third arrives. And as the house darkened, and the wind began to rise over the hedgerows, the shadow of the man in the garden crept closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 4. Shadows Beneath the Surface. The following morning dawned with a grey, sullen sky. Clouds had rolled in overnight, casting a silvery gloom over Willoughby Hall. A cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the countryside seemed to hold its breath beneath the low-hanging mist. Poirot, however, remained undeterred by the weather, dressed immaculately as always, his dark suit pressed, shoes gleaming, and moustache finely waxed. He descended the staircase with a focused glint in his eyes. Hastings, though less awake and more grumbling about the lack of sunshine, joined him dutifully for another round of investigations. After a brief breakfast, during which conversation remained strained and guarded, Poirot sought out Lady Willoughby in her morning room. She was seated at her escritoire, sorting through correspondence, her expression tight with distraction. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said as he entered, "do come in. I've been expecting you." "Then you know why I've come, madame?" Poirot asked, bowing slightly. "I have my suspicions," she replied, gesturing for him to sit opposite her. "You are wondering what secrets this house hides. You think the green glove is more than a childish prank." "It is no prank," Poirot said firmly. "And this house, like all old houses, has its shadows." Lady Willoughby looked away. "There are things one does not speak of, not in polite society, not even to oneself." "Then let us speak without the bounds of politeness, madame. Speak of truths, of things lost or forgotten, but not gone." There was a long pause. Finally she turned to him, her voice low. 22 years ago, something happened here. Before Lawrence and I were married. It was long before Estelle joined us. In those days, the house was full of guests, always some dinner party or hunt, and one autumn, oddly enough, around this same time, a woman named Margaret Ashcombe stayed for a fortnight. Poirot nodded gently. "And what became of Miss Ashcombe?" "She vanished," Lady Willoughby said flatly. "One morning she simply did not appear. Her room was found untouched. Her things were still packed. No note, no luggage missing. She had walked into the garden the evening before, and was never seen again." Poirot's brows lifted. "And this was reported?" "Of course. Scotland Yard was summoned. There was a great fuss, but no body, no signs of struggle, nothing. Eventually, it was decided she must have left of her own will. But I knew Margaret. She was not the kind to vanish. And she had a particular fondness for a young man, a footman, no longer in service here. You suspect foul play, Poirot murmured. I suspected something went wrong. A quarrel, an accident, or worse. And who else was in the house at the time? Lady Willoughby hesitated. My husband, of course. Lawrence was young then, and wild. There were rumours, you understand, about his liaisons. But Margaret was no fool, and he swore to me later he knew nothing of her disappearance. Poirot steepled his fingers, and no trace of her was ever found. None. Until now, perhaps, Lady Willoughby said, because here you are, with your green glove, your mysterious stranger in the garden. It feels connected. Poirot rose. Merci, madame. You have been most brave to tell me this. Now I must investigate this matter, as one would reawaken a corpse, not without risk, but with great care. As he departed the morning room, he found Hastings waiting in the hall. Well, Hastings asked, any luck? We are unearthing a buried past, mon ami, Poirot said quietly, and I believe this past may yet be dangerous. They made their way to the library, where Estelle Frobisher sat reading. Her expression was distant, distracted, but she greeted them politely. Enough, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. Did you ever hear of a woman named Margaret Ashcombe? Estelle blinked. No, should I have? She was a guest at this house many years ago. She disappeared. Estelle paled slightly. I didn't know. Lady Willoughby never spoke of it. Few do, when there is shame attached, Poirot said. Tell me, you were close with Alicia Drayton, are you not? We were at finishing school together. Estelle said slowly. She's complicated. In what way? Estelle hesitated. She's had a difficult past. Her mother died when she was very young. Her father was, well, not a gentleman. She's always been secretive, but I believe she's afraid of something. Or someone, Poirot added. Perhaps the man in the garden. Estelle frowned. She denied knowing him. But she lies easily, I think, when she's frightened. Poirot nodded. Merci, mademoiselle. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested to see Alicia. She agreed, albeit reluctantly, and joined him in the small salon, where the fire crackled warmly against the growing chill. Miss Drayton, Poirot said softly, you are in some distress. I ask you now, not as a detective, but as a friend. Who was the man in the garden? Her eyes darted toward the window. I told you, I don't know. You do, he said gently, and I believe he is connected to your past. Perhaps even your family. Alicia's hands trembled. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Finally she whispered, he might be my father. Poirot did not react outwardly. You believed him dead? I was told he died in France when I was 10. But once, years later, I found a letter, unsigned, unposted. It spoke of guilt, of regret. I destroyed it, but I never forgot it. And you believe he has returned? I don't know. I don't want to know. He was cruel, Monsieur Poirot. My mother ran from him. She brought me here for safety. And Margaret Ashcombe? Poirot asked softly. Do you know her name? Alicia swallowed. She was my mother's cousin. They were close. Margaret stayed with us before she came here. She used to wear green gloves. Poirot's eyes lit up. Ah, now we begin to see. Perhaps the green glove was never meant to frighten. It was meant to remind. To remind whom? Whoever is guilty, mademoiselle. And the guilty do not sleep well when the past returns in velvet. That night, as the house slept uneasily, under the whisper of wind and the creak of branches, Poirot paced in his room. The puzzle was coming together, piece by piece, but something still eluded him. A motive, yes. A method, unclear. And the identity of the man in the garden. He stood at the window and looked down upon the moonlit lawns. Shadows danced between hedges and statues, shifting with the breeze. And then, quite suddenly, he saw a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, standing by the sundial. Poirot did not move, nor did the man. For one breathless moment they regarded each other across the darkness. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the mist. Poirot stepped back from the window. "The past," he whispered, "has come to collect its due." Chapter 5. Whispers in the Maze. The next morning arrived cloaked in a soft drizzle. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Willoughby Hall, as if trying to enter, and the entire estate seemed hushed beneath the grey veil of weather. Breakfast was a muted affair. Lord Willoughby was conspicuously absent, and Lady Willoughby made only a brief appearance before retreating to her room, citing a headache. The remaining guests picked over their food with nervous glances and hushed murmurs. Poirot, meanwhile, was in his element. He had risen early, and had already completed a thorough examination of the eastern wing of the house. With the housekeeper's reluctant assistance, he had obtained access to the old servants' corridors, narrow, unused passageways that ran behind the panelled walls, and connected the former staff quarters to various parts of the house. It was there, he suspected, that many secrets lay buried. "Hidden doors, Hastings," he remarked as they emerged from the dim corridor into the upper gallery, "are rather like hidden truths. They are rarely far, merely unacknowledged." "I never understood why people build secret corridors in the first place," said Hastings, brushing cobwebs from his sleeve. "Seems a bit sinister." "For discretion," Poirot said, "for privacy, and occasionally for love affairs. Or crimes. Or crimes." Their next stop was the garden. Despite the weather, Poirot insisted on walking the grounds. With umbrella in hand, he paced along the gravel paths, through the rose arbor, and across the lawns, studying each angle and perspective. Eventually, they came to the hedge maze, which sat in a secluded corner of the estate. It was an elaborate, somewhat overgrown structure, with high walls of yew and a central stone pedestal long devoid of ornament. "I believe this is where the man in the green velvet glove disappeared," Poirot said. "Mademoiselle Alicia last saw him just beyond the sundial, did she not? This would have been the direction he fled." Hastings shivered. "You don't think he's hiding in there still?" "No, but I think he used it as cover. Observe, there are broken twigs along this edge, footprints in the wet grass. And here—" Poirot knelt and carefully extracted a thin, torn scrap of green velvet snagged on a thorn. "Mon ami," he said, standing and holding it up triumphantly. "The glove has left us another clue." Back inside, Poirot summoned Estelle, Alicia, and the two remaining house guests, Major Arbuthnot and Miss Dunning, to the drawing-room. The group sat in varying states of discomfort, while Poirot stood before the fireplace. "We have uncovered much," he began, "but there is still more to learn. Miss Drayton, I must ask, have you spoken to Lord Willoughby about your suspicions regarding the man in the garden?" Alicia looked startled. "No, I haven't spoken to him about anything." Poirot turned to Estelle. "And you, mademoiselle?" Estelle shook her head. "Lord Willoughby hasn't left his study since yesterday evening." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "Most curious indeed." He turned to Major Arbuthnot. "Major, forgive me, but have you ever heard of a woman named Margaret Ashcombe?" The Major frowned deeply. "Ashcombe rings a bell. Was she the one who vanished years ago? I was posted in India at the time, but I remember the scandal. Wasn't there talk of her running off with a footman?" "So it was said," Poirot replied, "but there was never any proof." Miss Dunning, pale and clutching her knitting needles with white knuckles, looked up suddenly. "It was a lie," she said quietly. All eyes turned toward her. "What was that, Miss Dunning?" Poirot asked gently. "I was here then," she said, "a young companion to Lady Willoughby's aunt. Margaret Ashcombe didn't run off. She was kind, gentle. She would never have left like that." "Did you see anything?" Poirot asked softly. Miss Dunning hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "No, but I remember noises, raised voices in the garden late at night, and the next morning Margaret was gone." Poirot leaned forward. "Who was arguing? I don't know. But I saw Lord Willoughby out in the garden very early, muddy and dishevelled. I remember it because it was so out of character." A sudden silence followed. At that moment the door opened, and Lord Willoughby himself entered, his face drawn and grey. "I imagine you are all discussing me," he said bitterly. "As usual." "Indeed," Poirot said calmly. "Would you care to speak with me in private, milord?" Willoughby hesitated. Then, with a short nod, he turned and led Poirot to his study. Hastings followed, notebook in hand, as always. Once the door closed behind them, Lord Willoughby dropped into a chair. "I suppose you've come to accuse me," he said. "I accuse no one," Poirot replied. "I seek only the truth." There was a long pause. Finally, Willoughby sighed. "It was an affair, a foolish one. Margaret and I, it meant nothing. But she thought it did. She threatened to tell Charlotte. And then she disappeared." Poirot said. "I swear to you, I didn't harm her. We argued, yes. She was distraught. I told her I couldn't marry her. She ran into the garden. I followed her, but lost her in the dark. That was the last time I saw her." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And the glove? Why does it return now?" Willoughby's face tightened. "I don't know, but I've had dreams of Margaret standing by the sundial, wearing that cursed green glove, watching me." "Guilt has its voice, milord," Poirot said, "but I believe someone else is speaking louder now." He stood. "You have told me enough, for now." As Poirot left the study, Hastings followed him, clearly bursting with questions. "What now, Poirot?" "Now," Poirot said, "we set a trap. That old trick again. It rarely fails, mon ami," Poirot said with a smile. That evening, Poirot sent notes to each guest, requesting their presence in the drawing-room after dinner. When they arrived, they found the room dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. In the center of the room, On a velvet cushion lay the green glove. A hush fell. Poirot stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this glove belonged to Margaret Ashcombe. It vanished with her, and now it has returned. Someone among us knows why, and tonight I believe the truth will be revealed." There was a gasp as the lights suddenly flickered and went out. In the dark there was a sharp cry, the sound of a scuffle, and the unmistakable crash of a chair overturned. Poirot's voice cut through the confusion. "Hastings, lights if you please." The lights returned, and everyone froze. In the centre of the room stood Alicia Drayton, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. At her feet lay Lord Willoughby, bleeding from a wound to the head, and in Alicia's hand, trembling, gloved in green, was a fireplace poker. Poirot stepped forward slowly. "The past," he said softly, "has caught up at last." Chapter 6. A Legacy of Shadows. The scene was still, eerily so. Alicia stood as if frozen, the green velvet glove slipping from her hand and falling silently to the carpet. Lord Willoughby groaned softly, the blood at his temple a stark crimson against the white of his hair. Poirot was the first to move, striding forward with surprising swiftness to kneel at the fallen man's side. Hastings followed, retrieving a napkin from the drinks table to press against the wound. "He's alive," Poirot announced. "Only a glancing blow." Alicia seemed to stir at last. I didn't mean to," she stammered. "He came at me. He grabbed the glove. I panicked." Poirot raised a hand. "Mademoiselle, calm yourself. No one is accusing you yet. But you must tell us everything. No more secrets." The room, filled with stunned silence moments before, now erupted into urgent voices. "What on earth is going on?" Estelle demanded. "What glove?" asked Miss Dunning, still clutching her knitting needles as though they were weapons. Poirot looked around at them all, his gaze piercing. "Please, mes amis, if you will give us a moment, Mademoiselle Alicia and I will speak in the library, alone." The others hesitated but slowly filed out, leaving Poirot, Hastings, and Alicia behind. Poirot guided the young woman gently toward a chair. "Begin at the beginning, mademoiselle," he said softly. "You knew more than you let on." Alicia's hands trembled. "Yes," she whispered, "I lied, but only because I was afraid. I thought if I told the truth, no one would believe me." "Try me," said Poirot, folding his arms. "I was exploring the old wing of the house 2 days before the party began," she said. "It's mostly unused, dusty, and shut off. I like old places. History clings to them. I found a room, small, locked, hidden behind one of the servants' passages. Inside there was an old trunk, and in that trunk I found it, the glove." She paused, gathering herself. "There were letters, too, love letters, from Margaret Ashcombe to Lord Willoughby. He kept them all these years." "Mon Dieu!" whispered Hastings. "I didn't know what to do. I confronted him yesterday. I wanted answers. But he denied everything. Said Margaret was unstable, said she'd run away. But his eyes. He was lying. I know he was." Poirot steepled his fingers. "So you left the glove where he would see it?" "As a message." Alicia nodded. "Yes, I thought, if he believed someone knew the truth, he might confess." "And when he did not?" Poirot asked. "I brought the glove down to the drawing-room tonight. I thought If I made him face it, face everyone, it would all come out. But instead, he attacked you? No, not at first. He came toward me, took the glove. His face changed, like he'd seen a ghost. He started shouting, accusing me. And then he lunged. I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop. Poirot studied her carefully. The truth is complicated, mademoiselle, but you have been braver than most. A soft knock came at the door. It was Estelle, pale and serious. Lord Willoughby is awake, she said. The doctor has been summoned. He insists on speaking with you. Poirot rose. Then let us waste no time. They returned to the drawing-room where Willoughby sat on the sofa, a bandage across his brow, his face drawn and hollow. You found it, he said hoarsely, staring at Alicia. The glove? Poirot nodded. Yes, my lord, and more than that. It is time, I think, for the truth. Willoughby's gaze drifted toward the window, the grey rain still misting the glass. She never left, he said at last. Margaret, she died here, in this house. A collective gasp sounded, but Poirot remained calm. Tell us. She came to me late one night, he said. She had found out Charlotte was pregnant. She flew into a rage, said she'd destroy us both. I tried to calm her, but she was hysterical. She grabbed one of the fire pokers, threatened to hurt herself. We struggled. She fell, struck her head on the marble hearth. His voice cracked. She died instantly. There was no time to think. Estelle took a trembling step forward. You buried her, didn't you? Willoughby nodded. In the maze, beneath the old sundial. No one ever used it, and I thought, foolishly, that time would bury the past. Poirot closed his eyes for a long moment. And the glove? Hastings asked. I kept it. A reminder, a penance, perhaps. I locked it away in the attic room. When it vanished, I knew someone had found her secret. Poirot turned to Alicia. And the letters? I left them in the trunk, she said. I couldn't bring myself to take them. Poirot nodded slowly. Then the evidence remains. Enough to involve the police. Willoughby's head fell back against the cushions. Perhaps that's justice. Charlotte always suspected. She never said it, but I think she knew. And she stayed. For Estelle. Estelle stepped forward. For me? Her voice was almost a whisper. She loved you, Willoughby said. And she didn't want you to grow up with scandal. Poirot rose, straightening his tie. I will call the inspector, but I believe the case will not be a simple one. It is not murder, not quite, nor is it innocence, but it is at last the truth. Later that evening, the police arrived. Statements were taken, evidence collected. The sundial was lifted, and the remains of Margaret Ashcombe were discovered in a shallow grave beneath. It was as if the maze had kept its secret all these years, waiting for someone to finally hear the whisper of velvet in the shadows. Poirot and Hastings returned to their rooms late, the house quiet once more. Extraordinary, said Hastings, to think, right, beneath our feet the whole time. Poirot stood at the window, watching the mist swirl through the hedges of the maze. People bury more than bones, Hastings. They bury guilt, shame, and memories. But such things do not stay buried forever. He turned, a hint of sadness inside his eyes. It is the tragedy of human nature, but also its redemption. for even in darkness there is always someone who seeks the light, and with that he extinguished the lamp, leaving only the pale glimmer of moonlight upon the velvet shadows of Willoughby Hall. Chapter 7. Whispers behind the tapestries by morning. Willoughby Hall had become a hushed and uneasy place. Willoughby Hall had become a hushed and uneasy place. The police had taken Lord Willoughby into custody just before dawn. Though not in handcuffs, his rank and frailty afforded him certain courtesies. The grim discovery in the garden maze beneath the sundial had sealed his fate. Margaret Ashcombe's long-vanished ghost had finally spoken, and Poirot's investigation was the medium through which her tale had returned to haunt the living. Poirot rose early, as was his habit, and consumed his breakfast with precise care. Toast, perfectly brown, soft-boiled eggs exactly 4 minutes, and a strong cup of black coffee. Hastings joined him, more bleary-eyed and subdued than usual. "Well, the house feels like a tomb this morning," Hastings muttered, reaching for a piece of toast. "Estelle hasn't left her room. Alicia's gone for a walk, and Miss Dunning's in the library, knitting like a woman possessed." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, mon ami. The truth, once revealed, casts a long shadow. But there's something that doesn't sit quite right with me," Hastings added, lowering his voice. "If Lord Willoughby buried the past, why would he keep the glove at all? Why not burn it? Destroy the letters? He was so meticulous otherwise." "Très bien, Hastings. You begin to think like Poirot." Hastings flushed with pride, then looked puzzled. "Wait, what are you suggesting?" Poirot stood. "That we have the motive and the confession but not the full picture. I believe there is more to this story. Come, let us take a final stroll through the house. I would like to examine something. Something about the green velvet glove troubles me deeply." The two men made their way down the long corridor to the old wing of the house. The part Alicia had described as dusty and rarely used. The air was chillier here, the smell of age and wood polish stronger. Tapestries hung along the walls, faded and moth-eaten, their scenes depicting pastoral mythologies of nymphs and satyrs, now dulled with time. Poirot paused before one particular tapestry that hung opposite a carved door, the kind that likely led to a servant's stair. "This is the room, Hastings," he murmured, "where Alicia claims to have found the glove." He pushed open the door. Dust motes spun in shafts of light from a narrow window. The old trunk sat beneath a draped table, its lid ajar. Inside were several neatly stacked bundles of old linen, an opera program dated 1899, and, as Alicia had said, letters in delicate handwriting addressed to "My dearest Lionel." Poirot extracted one of the letters and scanned its contents. "A woman's hand, certainly," he murmured. "Tender, poetic. Yes, this is Margaret." "Could it be forged?" Hastings asked. Poirot shook his head. "No, this is genuine. But what I begin to wonder is whether Lord Willoughby ever actually opened this trunk." "What do you mean?" Poirot held up a hand and pointed to the dust lining the edges of the lid. "See, mon ami, this dust has settled in a pattern that indicates the trunk has not been properly opened in some time. Perhaps the glove was placed here recently by someone who wanted it found." Hastings looked startled. "You mean someone planted the evidence?" "Just so. Let us ask. Who would have the motive to see Lord Willoughby exposed? Who would benefit from dragging the past into the present? They returned to the drawing-room, where Miss Dunning was seated in her usual chair, her knitting needles clicking like the ticking of a tiny clock. She looked up with cool eyes as they entered. "Detective," she said, "you must be pleased with yourself." "Not at all, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "To uncover a body is not to uncover peace." She blinked, her expression unreadable. "Miss Dunning," he continued, "how long have you been in service to this household?" 36 years. "Then you knew Margaret Ashcombe?" The needles stopped for the first time. "Yes," she said at last, "I did." "What was she like?" Miss Dunning's gaze drifted toward the fire. "Beautiful, proud, and passionate." She did not accept her situation with quiet dignity. She burned with it. "I admired her, I suppose, though I never understood why she let herself become a shadow." Poirot sat opposite her. "May I ask, mademoiselle, did you ever go into the old wing?" A flicker, just the faintest, passed across her face. "No," she said, "not for years." "But you knew the passageways?" "Yes, as all the older servants did." Poirot leaned in slightly. "Did you know about the trunk and the glove?" Miss Dunning stared at him for a long moment. "Yes." Hastings gave a start, but Poirot held up a calming hand. "I see. And you placed the glove there, did you not?" Miss Dunning exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because no one else would. Because that poor girl vanished, and everyone let her name be buried. I knew Lord Willoughby was responsible, not necessarily for her death, but for her despair, for her erasure." "You knew she was dead?" "I suspected it," she said. "I didn't know for certain. But when Alicia came to me and told me about the glove, she thought it meant something. She didn't know what. I did. I told her to leave it where she'd found it." Poirot tilted his head. "But then later you placed it in the drawing-room." "Yes, because I realized Lord Willoughby was never going to confess. I thought if someone confronted him publicly, he might be forced to. And so Alicia became the accidental instrument of your justice." Miss Dunning's face darkened. "She has courage, that girl, and a sense of right and wrong. I didn't expect it to end in violence." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then I must ask, do you still have the other glove?" She hesitated. Then from the basket beside her chair, she lifted a folded cloth and opened it. Within lay the matching green velvet glove, pristine, untouched. "I kept it," she said, "a reminder of what silence costs." Poirot took the glove gently and nodded once. "That is all, mademoiselle. The police may wish to speak with you." She returned to her knitting, hands steady now. As they left the room, Hastings looked over at Poirot. "So what now? Do you tell the police you planted evidence?" "She committed no crime," Poirot said quietly. "She revealed the truth in her own way. And the result, though dramatic, was just. Sometimes, Hastings, justice is not a clean line. It is a shadow that must fall in the right place." "Still," Hastings said, "I can't help but feel we've disturbed more than one ghost here." Poirot looked back toward the drawing-room, where Miss Dunning's needles had resumed their rhythmic click. "Yes," he said, "but perhaps they needed disturbing." Outside, the sky had cleared at last, and the gardens of Willoughby Hall glistened with the pale gold of early spring. Yet in the hedges of the maze the past lingered still, silent, patient, and finally seen. Chapter 8. The Secret of the Velvet Room. The atmosphere at Willoughby Hall had grown taut with silence. Despite the revelations of the previous day, Poirot remained unsatisfied. There was a sense, elusive and unsettling, that something deeper lay beneath the layers, already peeled away. The planting of the glove had shocked Hastings, but Poirot had accepted Miss Dunning's confession with quiet equanimity. Yet, as he stared out the library window the following morning, his fingers gently tapping the arm of a deep leather chair, his thoughts churned with questions. It was Alicia who interrupted his reverie. "I'm sorry to intrude, Monsieur Poirot," she said, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "Ah, mademoiselle, not at all. You are most welcome," Poirot said, turning with a smile. "Come, join me." Alicia moved into the room with less of her usual composure. The strain of the past few days had taken its toll, her posture less rigid, her eyes a little shadowed. "I wanted to thank you," she began, "for listening, for believing that something was wrong, even when no one else did. You have a strong instinct, mademoiselle. It is often women such as you who sense what is not spoken." She hesitated. "I've been thinking about the glove, and Miss Dunning, and about Lady Margaret. I hardly knew her, of course. I was just a child. But the house always seemed colder after she disappeared, quieter." Poirot inclined his head. "That is the echo of grief, mademoiselle. It dulls the air." "I want to know the whole truth," Alicia said suddenly, a quiet urgency in her voice. "Not just about law, Willoughby, about everything." Poirot's eyes glimmered. "As do I. Which is why I believe there is one room in this house we have not yet truly explored." He stood and beckoned her to follow. Hastings joined them in the hallway, curious but cautious. "Where are we off to now?" he asked. "To the Velvet Room," Poirot replied. "The what?" Alicia answered for him. "It's what we used to call the morning salon in the East Wing. The walls are hung with deep green velvet. I thought it had been shut up for years." Poirot gave a nod. "Let us see whether the past has truly left it undisturbed." They made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of Willoughby Hall, past ancestral portraits and faded oil paintings, until they reached a heavy door with a brass handle. It creaked open with the groan of disuse. Dust curled in the sunlight that filtered through the tall windows. The velvet walls were still intact, dark green and sombre. A faint perfume lingered in the air, lavender perhaps, or something more elusive, more floral. "It was Lady Margaret's favourite room," Alicia whispered. "She used to paint here, I think." Poirot walked slowly around the perimeter, his hands clasped behind his back. The room was empty save for a spindly writing desk, a chaise longue by the window, and a covered easel in the corner. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the easel. Alicia gave a slight nod, clearly unnerved. Poirot lifted the dust cloth, revealing a half-finished oil painting. Abstract, moody, with bold strokes of emerald and grey, it showed a figure standing alone in a garden maze, her back turned. There was a red smear near the figure's hands. Not blood, but perhaps a rose falling. "A striking image," Poirot said. Do you know if she painted this herself? Think so, Alicia said. She was always experimenting with colour and mood. Hastings frowned. Seems rather bleak. Poirot was silent for a moment, then turned toward the writing desk. It was locked. Ah, he murmured, but Poirot comes prepared. He drew a small set of tools from his inner coat pocket, and with the delicacy of a jeweller, manipulated the lock until it clicked open. Inside were several yellowed pages, a dried-out inkwell, and a small folded letter tied with green ribbon. He removed the letter and held it out for Alicia. Would you prefer to read it? She took it with trembling fingers and untied the ribbon. Her eyes scanned the page slowly, her brow furrowing. It's addressed to someone named Cecilia. Her sister, maybe? Poirot nodded. Go on. Alicia began to read aloud. Dearest Cecilia, if this reaches you, it means I have done something terribly foolish. I cannot bear it any more. Lionel says he loves me, but I am hidden from the world like a sin. Every morning I sit in the green room and wonder if I will ever be free, but I am not strong, not like mother was. I fear what I might do if left alone too long. If he will not marry me, then let him live with the guilt. She stopped, her voice cracking. Poirot took the letter gently from her hand and folded it. Lady, Margaret wrote this shortly before she disappeared. There is no doubt. So, she killed herself? Hastings asked, incredulous. Poirot shook his head. No, she intended to, but whether she did, or was prevented or silenced, remains the final question. Alicia sat on the chaise longue, her expression haunted. I always thought she'd been murdered, that someone had gotten rid of her. Poirot turned toward her, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle, when one is silenced by shame, by secrecy, by the powerful forces of society and patriarchy, it is, in a way, a kind of murder. They sat in silence for a while. The light shifting on the green walls. Then Poirot said quietly, There is one more detail that troubles me. Hastings glanced up. Another glove? No, mon ami. A question of identity. Margaret wrote this letter to Cecilia, but there is no record of such a sister in the family registry. And the style of handwriting, it bears a remarkable resemblance to that of Miss Dunning. Alicia gasped. You mean Miss Dunning is Cecilia? It is possible, or perhaps simply a friend who adopted the name to shield the truth. Either way, she knew more than she ever let on. I believe she was Margaret's confidant, and possibly the last person to see her alive. They returned to the drawing-room, where Miss Dunning was once again, knitting with quiet precision. Poirot sat beside her. We have visited the velvet room, he said softly. Her hands paused. She did not look up. You kept her letter, he continued. You protected it all these years. But now the truth must be spoken. Miss Dunning said nothing for a long while. Then, without stopping her knitting, she murmured, She died in my arms. Poison. I found her that night. I begged her to stay, to fight, to confront him. But she had made up her mind. She didn't want scandal. She didn't want her child, yes, there was a child, to be born into disgrace. I couldn't save her. Poirot bowed his head. And so you hid the truth. I buried her in the garden maze, she said. At her request, she made me swear, and I did. But now I wonder if that promise was a sin." Poirot reached out and gently stilled her needles. "You did what you could. You showed courage in the face of great sorrow." She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening. "I thought I'd protected her legacy, but I only let the lies fester." "No, mademoiselle, you gave us the key to the truth, and that is what matters." As Poirot and Hastings left the drawing-room, the hall behind them seemed a little brighter, the silence less suffocating. The final answers were near, and soon all would be revealed. Chapter 9. The Maze in the Moonlight. The grounds of Willoughby Hall were quiet in the pale hush of evening. The garden stretched out like a quilt of shadow and silver, the moonlight resting softly on the hedges and stone paths. Poirot stood near the entrance to the garden maze, his silhouette sharp against the gravel drive. Beside him, Hastings shifted, uneasily, peering into the tall, trimmed walls of ivy that formed the maze. "You really think she's buried in there?" he asked, lowering his voice as if the maze itself might be listening. Poirot nodded slowly. Miss Dunning spoke plainly. She gave no detail of the exact location, but the maze was Margaret's sanctuary, her retreat from the world. I believe it was where she chose to end her story. It is fitting. They had waited until the rest of the household was asleep. Poirot had no desire to draw attention. The constable stationed at the village post had been discreetly summoned. A fake coroner's involvement would come later, once Poirot had confirmed what he already knew. "Come, Hastings, we must find the centre." The two men entered the maze, Poirot walking with purposeful grace, his steps silent on the damp earth. The paths twisted and forked, but Poirot moved as if guided by instinct or perhaps memory. Not his own, but Margaret's. He stopped occasionally, tilting his head, listening. The maze was utterly still, save for the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a night-bird. It was nearly 20 minutes before they reached the heart of the maze. A small clearing opened before them. In its centre stood a weathered stone bench, half covered in moss. A few wildflowers had crept in through cracks in the hedge. The moonlight illuminated the area with a spectral glow. Poirot walked forward, kneeling beside the bench. He studied the ground with the precision of a jeweller inspecting a diamond. There was a slight rise in the soil, subtle but unmistakable. A place where the earth had been disturbed and then settled long ago. "It is here," he said simply. Hastings looked down, then exhaled. "Good Lord!" Poirot reached into his coat and removed a small spade. Hastings blinked at it. "You carry that in your pocket?" "One must always be prepared for all eventualities, mon ami, especially when the garden may hide secrets more enduring than flowers." He dug carefully, methodically. The earth was soft, the roots gentle, and it was not long before the spade struck something more solid. Poirot paused, then brushed aside the soil. A flash of pale, faded fabric appeared. Then, beneath it, the unmistakable edge of a bone. Hastings looked away. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. He placed the spade down gently, then stood, brushing the soil from his knees. "Lady Margaret Willoughby," he said softly. "We have found you at last." They stood in silence for a time, the weight of the discovery settling like mist around them. Hastings cleared his throat. "So what now?" "Now," Poirot replied, "we summon the proper authorities, and then we gather everyone together. The truth must be revealed before the sun rises on another day of lies." By midday, the drawing-room at Willoughby Hall was once again filled with tension. Lord Willoughby sat in a high-backed chair, pale but defiant. Alicia stood by the window, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Miss Dunning sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Only Edward Tunstall had not joined them. Poirot had instructed he remain in his quarters, though no one yet knew why. Poirot stood before them all, his bearing quiet and composed. Hastings watched from a nearby corner, notebook in hand, though he knew better than to try and capture all the details Poirot would lay out. It was the kind of revelation that demanded attention, not scribbles. "My friends," Poirot began, "we have reached the end of the labyrinth. The mystery that has clung to Willoughby Hall for over a decade has finally been unravelled, and it begins not with murder, but with heartbreak." He turned to Lord Willoughby. "You courted Lady Margaret under a false promise. You never intended to marry her, though you led her to believe otherwise. When she became pregnant, you refused to acknowledge the child. You threatened her with disgrace, with expulsion from society. You forced her into isolation, into shame." Willoughby's lip curled. She was naive. She couldn't handle the truth. "She was abandoned," Poirot said sharply, "and she chose to end her life in the one place she still found solace, her garden. She took poison in the velvet room and died that night." Miss Dunning's eyes glistened with tears. She nodded faintly, confirming the truth. "But," Poirot continued, "that is not the end of the tale, for Lady Margaret did not die alone. She gave birth, quietly, prematurely, in that very room, and the child did not die." Alicia turned sharply. "What?" Poirot turned toward her. "The child was you, mademoiselle." Alicia froze. The silence shattered like glass. "You were raised by an aunt who kept the truth from you." But Miss Dunning always knew. She remained in Willoughby Hall, not out of loyalty to its master, but out of love for Margaret and a desire to watch over you. "No," Alicia whispered, "that's not—" "It is the truth, mademoiselle. Your mother painted a portrait of herself in the maze, a message to the world that she existed, that she suffered, that she loved. Miss Dunning kept the letter and the secret all these years, but when the green velvet glove reappeared, planted by Lord Willoughby to frighten you away, she could stay silent no longer." Willoughby stood abruptly. "This is madness. She's just a girl, a foundling, nothing to do with—" "Enough," Miss Dunning said quietly. Her voice was steadier than it had been in days. "I held Margaret's hand as she died. I held her daughter, wrapped her in blankets, and swore I would find her a home where she would be safe. Margaret begged me to spare her the scandal. I did as she asked, but I should have spoken sooner." Alicia stared at her, wide-eyed, her lips trembling. "You knew all this, and you didn't tell me?" "I was afraid," Miss Dunning said. "Afraid you'd be taken from me again. But now you have the right to know." Poirot stepped forward gently. Mademoiselle, your mother loved you. She gave her life to protect you. And now the truth is no longer buried." Alicia sat slowly, her hands trembling. Hastings moved to offer a glass of water, but she waved it away, staring down at her palms as if trying to see something that had always been hidden there. "And Edward?" Hastings asked. "Where does he fit in?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Edward Tunstall is an opportunist. He caught wind of the family scandal through old correspondence he intercepted. He used the information to blackmail Lord Willoughby. Hence, the sudden announcement of Alicia's inheritance and Edward's supposed engagement. But he did not anticipate Poirot. "And what will happen to Lord Willoughby?" Alicia asked, her voice hollow. "That is not for me to say," Poirot replied. "But the truth has power, and now you have that power, mademoiselle." He turned away, his gaze falling on the window, where the gardens shimmered in the sun. Somewhere beyond, the maze waited, silent no longer. Tomorrow, the press would learn of the remains uncovered in the heart of Willoughby Hall. An inquest would be opened. Questions would flood the quiet countryside. But for Poirot, the mystery was solved. A green velvet glove had led to a grave, and in that grave a broken heart had finally found its voice. Chapter 10. The Final Revelation. The morning after the revelation was not a morning of celebration. Willoughby Hall, once a sprawling monument to family pride and privilege, now felt more like a tomb. The walls, though still majestic, seemed to hum with the weight of secrets. Poirot sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the drawing-room, his hands clasped, his eyes staring out the window at the manicured lawns beyond. There were still so many threads to untangle, and while the truth had come to light, the resolution had not yet fully arrived. Miss Dunning had remained at Willoughby Hall, now more determined than ever to stand by Alicia. There was no doubt in Poirot's mind that the relationship between the two women had been tested, but was growing stronger with every passing hour. Alicia, for her part, had been silent for much of the morning, her eyes red from the tears she'd shed the previous night. She was no longer the young woman seeking answers to an old puzzle. She was a daughter now, a daughter with a name, a obedience of heritage, and a past that reached back to the very walls of Willoughby Hall. Poirot had spent most of the morning consulting with the local constable, discussing the next steps in the investigation. They were to bring in Lord Willoughby for questioning, though Poirot suspected it would take little more than a well-crafted statement to reveal the extent of his complicity in the cover-up. Lord Willoughby's guilt was clear, and though the man's pride might prevent him from fully confessing, Poirot knew his words would carry weight with the authorities. Hastings, as usual, was pacing, the larger-than-life figure of his friend. Poirot seemed to stand out even more, now that the mystery was winding down. Hastings was practical, eager for closure, yet he could sense that Poirot was still running through the puzzle in his mind, piecing together the last few clues. "Poirot," Hastings asked finally, as he stopped his pacing and crossed the room to stand by his friend, "are you satisfied? I mean, with the way things have gone. It's not the kind of mystery we're used to solving. This one, well, it's all a bit tragic, isn't it?" Poirot turned his gaze to his friend, his expression softening slightly. "Ah, Hastings, you must understand. The mystery of the green velvet glove was always a puzzle, yes, but it was also a story of pain. It was not simply a case of finding the guilty party or uncovering a hidden. It was not simply a case of finding the guilty party or uncovering a hidden treasure. It was about understanding the way in which lives are shaped by their pasts, by their secrets, by their mistakes. Hastings frowned. You think that's what this whole thing comes down to? Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. It is always about the people, my friend. We may admire the elegance of a well-executed crime, the cunning of a criminal mastermind, but we must never lose sight of the human element that drives them. Lady Margaret's life was twisted by fear and betrayal, and in the end, she chose to protect her daughter above all else, even at the cost of her own life. That is the tragedy. That is the real puzzle. Hastings was silent for a moment, processing his friend's words. The reality of the situation was hard to grasp. The mystery had been solved, but in a way that left no satisfaction, no joy. The answers Poirot had uncovered had come at a great cost, and now the fallout of that truth was starting to unravel. It was as if the veil that had shielded the inhabitants of Willoughby Hall from the world had finally been lifted, and they were standing exposed before a harsh, unforgiving light. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Poirot stood quickly, his sharp eyes meeting Hastings for a brief second of mutual understanding. "Enter," Poirot called. The door creaked open, and Alicia stepped into the room. She was dressed in dark mourning clothes, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors she had worn just days before. Her face, though pale, was composed, her expression distant yet resolute. She had come to make a decision. Poirot could see that much. The young woman was no longer adrift in uncertainty. She was now very much the lady of the house, though how she would choose to wield that power was yet to be determined. "Alicia," Poirot said gently, gesturing for her to sit. "You have made up your mind, I think?" Alicia's eyes flicked briefly to Hastings before returning to Poirot. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I have." Poirot remained quiet, allowing her to speak. "I am not going to leave Willoughby Hall," she continued. "I will not run away. I don't care if my father or anyone else wants me to go. This house is mine now. I will take my place here." Poirot smiled, a small approving smile that seemed to soften the sharp lines of his face. "You have made the right choice, mademoiselle. Your mother would be proud of you." Alicia's lips quivered for a moment, but she held herself together. "I know what I must do now. I will have to bring justice for Margaret, for her memory, and for all the women like her who were forced into silence. But I won't do it alone. Miss Dunning has already told me of her plans. She will help me see this through." Poirot nodded once again, his gaze steady. "Indeed, Miss Dunning has been a rock for you, Alicia. Her devotion to you speaks volumes about the kind of woman she is." Alicia glanced at the floor, then met Poirot's eyes again. "And what of Lord Willoughby?" she asked, her voice cold. "What will become of him?" Poirot's expression grew serious, though there was no malice in his words. "He will face the consequences of his actions. The law will deal with him. But more importantly, you will be free of him. There is no more power he can hold over you. He has no claim on you now." Alicia stood then, as though making a physical declaration of the new life she was about to embrace. "I will take the house and the legacy it holds, Poirot, and I will rebuild it. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for my mother and for myself." Poirot smiled, standing as well. He extended a hand to her. "It will be a heavy burden, mademoiselle, but you are strong. I have no doubt you will succeed." Hastings, who had been quietly observing the exchange, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Poirot," he said, "we've solved the mystery, and yet I can't shake the feeling that something more still hangs in the air." Poirot looked at his friend, his brow furrowed. "More?" Hastings nodded. "Yes, there's a certain weight to this case. The truth is out, but somehow it doesn't feel like it's enough." Poirot's gaze softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Ah, Hastings, there is always more, isn't there? The truth may be revealed, but sometimes the consequences of it are much more far-reaching than anyone can imagine. You are right to sense that something still lingers in the air." Alicia stepped forward, now fully engaged in the conversation. "You mean the people who are left behind, the ones who can't let go of the past?" "Exactly, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "It is often the case that when a secret is buried for so long, those who have lived in its shadow can never fully break free. They carry its weight with them for the rest of their lives. Lord Willoughby may face the law, but his guilt will follow him, and the others in this house, though they may now find peace, will never forget what they have lost." Alicia nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. Perhaps the truth is the only way to move forward, even if it means facing the darkness head-on. Poirot's expression softened as he took in her words. "Indeed, that is why you are the one who must lead Willoughby Hall into the future. There is no going back, no undoing the past, but you can make something new, something strong from the ruins." Hastings sighed, looking out the window. "Well, Poirot, I think it's time we leave this place behind." Poirot turned toward him with a glint in his eye. "Ah, Hastings, always eager to run from the scene of the crime. But remember, sometimes the end of one mystery marks the beginning of another." With those words, Poirot took a final glance at Willoughby Hall, his eyes briefly lingering on the distant maze. The past was gone, and the future was still uncertain. But for Alicia and for Miss Dunning, the path ahead was theirs to shape. The mystery of the green velvet glove had come to an end, but the journey of the heart, the journey to understand and to rebuild, was only just beginning.